Thank you. And welcome to this beautiful panel. And welcome to all of you. I'm so glad to see you, guys. And our names are on the wall. So I'll start right away with you, Anna-Laila. Whose story is being told?
Yes, that's a central question, at least for me. I went to film school in 2009, and we tried to, after that, to finance our Sami films from the National Film Institutes, and it was quite impossible at that time, at least. And that was the reason why we established the Sami Film Institute, our own funding body that can support our language films and our filmmakers and our talents. And of course, there has been a positive change in both in the Nordic countries, and now we are seeing the results of many years of hard work from the Sami film community, the talents from Sami Film Institute, and also our international indigenous collaborations. So many, like Hans Pieski's film here, and also bigger films, feature film series coming up. But it's still how to say, it's a struggle to dismantle the power structures that are still preventing our storytellers, our filmmakers and storytellers to have the same possibilities as filmmakers, for example, from the majority society. So, yeah, maybe to start with.
Do you feel powerful as the director of the Sami Film Institute?
That's a very interesting question. I feel an urge to do the work I do, and I feel it's really important for our people to have the visibility on the big screens in media, in cinema, because of history, because of the shared history we have with other indigenous peoples all across the world, with assimilation, still ongoing colonialism. We have so many important stories to share, and we need that visibility, which we have never had before when it comes to cinema specifically. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you. Jason, you worked with indigenous movie making in Canada for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of focus on the power of storytelling. But how do you feel the power dynamics is changing, or have they changed in the 20 years you've been working with it?
Yes, they have. I mean, I have, prior to my working for Toronto International Film Festival, I ran an indigenous organization in Toronto called Imaginative, which puts on the world's largest indigenous film festival of the same name. And when we founded that organization, it was an indigenous artist-focused festival. So that was the mandate. It was about building indigenous screen cultures, and not about showing indigenous content necessarily, or what people expected was indigenous content. It's been a long, I think 22 years, but a lot has changed. I think in Canada there was a confluence of a few things. In 2015 there was the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the impact of the residential schools. At the same time, Trudeau had a ministry-wide mandate to support all things Indigenous. There was the work and advocacy of Imaginative that built on decades of other activists doing the work. And I think other sectors too, really fighting for that place for Indigenous narrative sovereignty. And in the context of Canada, I mean, we're not equity seeking, we're sovereignty seeking. We are sovereign nations that are asserting our rights that are enshrined in our Constitution. And so through that, we're really advocating for an allocation of resources that were justly owed to us. Part of that was advocating for the establishment of the Indigenous Screen Office, which has been running now for 4 years. And 5 years ago, we launched an initiative that I spearheaded at Imaginative. It's a production framework called On-Screen Protocols and Pathways, which is a values-based, a principles-based framework for the production of any kind of screen-based content that has Indigenous characters, story, or place. And importantly, it's for all screen content creators. It's not just for non-Indigenous people. As an Anishinaabe person, I do not have a right to tell an Inuit story, for example. So this is a framework that talks about meaningful consent, collaboration, and importantly, reciprocity, which is something I think that is often overlooked.
It's called On-Screen Protocols and Pathways, and I would love for you to check it out because I've seen it, it's amazing. Anna Laila told me you have a bit of the same thing with Sami movie making called Pathfinder, which I would love people to check out as well. But Jason, a framework like that, could it be used for other sectors as well?
Yeah, I think when we released it, one of the things that surprised us was how many different industries and sectors reached out to us. I think it's a very pragmatic, very humanistic approach. And again, too, I think often there was this idea or notion that all things Indigenous were something esoteric or in the realm of sort of mysticism. But it's a really practical guide. And we really pitched it, which it is, like a co-production treaty, which is something that our funders use all the time within our nations and across nation states and whatnot. So again, it's something that's really pragmatic, and I know it's been implemented by all state funders in Canada, also regional funders, for screen content production. So it has absolutely changed and impacted the industry in Canada.
Amazing. I'd like to jump to you, Ritika, originally from India, now based in London, the founder of Prabhav Global, and you try to apply a transformative power of cultural intelligence for impactful leadership. How would you apply cultural intelligence to this debate, and what is it?
Okay, right. I'm going to start with an African proverb because obviously that's the mood of the day, right? Until the lion learns how to write, every story will always glorify the hunter. Yeah. Metaphorically, that's how dominant groups inscribe power through historical narrative. Let's start with that. And while we are in this obviously psychologically safe space, I want to challenge those in the audience a little further to think and reflect that even if the lion knows how to write beautifully, are we reading the lion story? And if we are reading the lion story, are we willing to accept his story? Yeah? So that's really the narrative I want to lead with. Now,
What about the zebra? Because the lion is a hunter too. When does a zebra learn to ride?
When that circle, then we end up at the ant, right? So, so that's I'll come to the ant, by the way, as well, towards the end. But according to Rousseau, yeah, one tool that sustains inequality, absolutely sustains inequality in the structures that we operate in right now, is divisiveness or divisiveness. Okay? And so this divisiveness is created through the narrative that is created by those in power. Look at what Trump just said this week about Haitian immigrants in Ohio. Okay? And now everyone's attacking Haitian immigrants when it's not even true what he's saying, but obviously that's what he's trying to do. Divisiveness, to want to hold on to that power. And so in order to even contemplate changing or shifting those power structures, the work that I do, we've finally come to cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence, how many of you have heard of this? How many of you heard? Oh, okay, we've got a few hands up. How many of you have heard of emotional intelligence? All right then, okay. So emotional intelligence works really well when you work with people that are just like you. Cultural intelligence takes off from where emotional intelligence leaves us, in that it is the ability to work with people that are different from us. Okay? And so the work I do with organizations around the world globally is really through that framework the CQ drive, which is the first capability in that framework, asks you why you even want to do this work.
With CQ being cultural intelligence.
CQ,
yes.
cultural quotient, very much like emotion quotient. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So we need to start within that framework from a storytelling perspective. We need to start with the why. Why do we even want to listen to different perspectives? Why should we want to hear different narratives? Maybe, perhaps, the current narrative serves us. So why should we bother to shake that? Okay, so that's where that starts from. So the CQ framework is about the drive, the knowledge. What knowledge do we need? Because when you know your why, you're thirsty. You're thirsty for the knowledge. And that will lead you to the action, which is what we are interested in. Prabhav means impact in Hindi. And someone like me, who's an immigrant woman of color, I'm interested in the impact. I'm not interested in the intent at all because I can't see it. It's invisible. I'm only interested in the impact. And the work that I do through cultural intelligence is exactly that, impactful leadership. And what does storytelling and narrative and how does all of that fit into that? So hopefully I've answered the question.
Thank you, Ritika. Now over to the most powerful person in this room, who sits on the last row. No, welcome, Henry. From the Arts Council Finland. I'm
That
called.
was me, you were-
Yeah, that was because you're representing the funders here. Do you use cultural intelligence in your work? And you can comment on the rest, of course.
Oh, thank you. I've heard, that was Aslak Holmberg's talk on the plenary in the morning session, and he used the word arrogance at least 3 times. Cultural arrogance, national arrogance.
Now you used it 3 times as well.
Yes, I've done that as well. I'm thinking of the hazard of not being arrogant in kind of getting involved and join these kinds of discussions. That's kind of my self-reflection that I'm now trying to think of. How did you present me in this panel? But as in terms of cultural intelligence, I would say that we are not using the phrase as such. We are not speaking, or we are not reflecting that we would be using cultural intelligence as such. But I would say that when peer reviewers are evaluating and assessing artists' application, there's always a strong commitment for reflection. And it's always based on subjective evaluation of subjective applications. So there are kind of 2 subjects that are confronting each other in a rather interesting way. And I would say that there's always a kind of negotiation in terms of how do we interpret different cultures when it comes to kind of deciding what is the nature of application and projects. So I would say that we are not using that as such, but I think we are getting somewhere close to that, maybe so.
You're representing a system.
Yeah, unfortunately.
How much can the system change itself?
If I may, I feel an urge to comment the film shortly. You were not asking anything about the film, but since many of you saw the film, and maybe somebody of you is thinking what's the connection with the film to the discussion, and a kind of sideway here in between. For me, the film it's both aesthetically beautiful and the content is very kind of important, and we learn a lot from the film. But for me, most important thing is the language that is being used in the film. And I'm here kind of thinking that if you would think seeing the same film in a way that, let's say, somebody like David Attenborough would be narrating the film and being narrator, the content would be totally different. So kind of the idea of authenticity is totally dependent on the language used and the way the language is being used. And I'm not sure whether Hans Bieski himself is narrating the film. Maybe
Yes,
some of you
yes,
know. So
yeah.
it's himself narrating it. The Sami language I don't actually know what is the Sami language, but the Sami that he's using, it's in intonation, it's kind of dramatic. Suomeksi me puhutaan aika sillä tavalla, lauseet ovat aika tylyjä ja ne tulevat päättymään aika nopeasti alaspäin. Tulee sellainen dramaattinen kaari siinä tavassa, miten me puhutaan. In other languages we might have intonation that might be more fluent and more kind of inspiring. In Finnish we are rather I'm not speaking Sami, I'm speaking Finnish, but the tone is rather, well, almost sad occasionally. There's kind of seriousness in the way of speaking. But that's an evidence what is the difference and meaning of the language used. Not only who gets a chance to get one's stories heard, but who is the one that we are actually listening to, him or herself. That makes a difference. But to your question, can a system make a difference within the system? I would say that here I am honored to present an organization that is based on peer reviewing processes, which means that I'm always confident that fellow artists are the best ones to try to make a change within the system. But saying that, I also have to be realistic and saying that that's not easy. That's not happening automatically. The fellow peers are not doing that automatically. They have to be kind of feeded that kind of idea that it's their responsibility. Because otherwise they might be kind of not reflectingly kind of repeating the status quo if they're not giving that person permission to make the change. And that's, I think, where the core is. Believing peer reviewers' abilities to make a change, but giving them special permission that, yes, you can make a change if you see that important, so that they know what is possible for them.
I think that's very powerful, and I think many people should. We heard a lot about it today, how you can change the system you are in. You must never forget that. I would really love to get a quick answer from each of you in the panel on, I would like you to give me an advice, because I work in the climate justice sector and culture sector. There's a lot of talk about storytelling and the representation. But how can I be a better listener when I see a movie like we saw here, or when I hear you talk? How should I listen? How can we train? How can we do capacity building to, when you talk today, Aslak, it was really powerful, but how can I implement it in my work?
I think this is a very good question, and first of all, when it comes to filmmaking, which is our passion and what we are working for, I think it's what Jason was also mentioning about the protocol, the pathways and protocols. It's important to acknowledge that fact that indigenous peoples, we have the right to tell our stories, because we haven't had that chance before, and so nothing about us without us. So collaboration, but also we are now in the Nordic countries in the process of truth and reconciliation processes, both in Norway, Finland and Sweden, and that has to change something, and that we need that engagement both from the majority societies, but also, of course, from the Sami society to educate. And it's not a responsibility for Sami people to educate majority people. You have to read and learn, and it's not our job to educate everybody. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna-Laila. Ritika, how can we be better story listeners?
In the previous panel, I heard we all have stories, and what stories I listen to is the stories I end up telling. So how do I listen? Let me tell you a story. And I told you I'll come to the ants. So the ants. Ants in the Amazon forest. Black ants and red ants living happily together, or living their own lives. Black ants were put into a jar, and then red ants were put into a jar. Even within the jar, they continue to forge their own path. Not troubling anyone, just getting on with their life. Someone came along, picked up that jar, and shook it. Okay? And then the ants started attacking each other. The red ants and the black ants started attacking each other. So I think the challenge here with regard to listening is to ask yourself, who shook the jar? With everything that's going on around in the world, and we see it in the media as it is, let's sit back for a second. Who shook the jar?
Do we get a multiple choice?
No.
Thank you.
I mean, just think about it, with what's going on with Gaza, what's going on with Lebanon right now, what's going on with the indigenous populations. Look at everything. Who shook the jar? And that'll really make us listen. That's what I think.
Thank you, Ritika. Jason.
My first response was what Anna Lila said. I mean, it's not our responsibility as Indigenous people to educate or inform. So I guess there's just a few things in my head right now. Our stories as oral cultures, our stories are important resources, and resources that are necessary for our survival. And in Canada, at the very least, so much of the Indigenous population is still in subsistence and survival mode. So for those of us in these privileged positions, always have to remind ourselves that stories are so central to our survival. And they've been mined and extracted and stolen from our cultures, specifically, I think, in North America, in Turtle Island. And we've had over a century of misrepresentation on screen that has led to a lot of the issues and exacerbated, the impacts of colonialism and struggles with post-colonialism. So we create stories for ourselves. And so with mechanisms like the Indigenous Screen Office or Indigenous-specific funding within state or provincial arts councils, all the decisions are made by Indigenous people. Will greenlight and approve different projects than non-Indigenous people with Indigenous content. Canada is no utopia, obviously. It's not certainly not a paradise. I think we use the same PR company as the Nordics. But again, but what we have done is at least succeeded in ensuring that Indigenous people are greenlighting, stories for screen. And it really comes down to this notion that, this idea of individual artistic freedom doesn't hold water for us. We have individual artistic creativity as artists creating screen content, but it's done within a context and responsibility to community and nation that we can never leave, that those who are from outside of the community don't have. They can just walk away, right? So that is such a key aspect in terms of, creating story and having permission to tell certain stories on screen.
Thank you. Henry, you started off by telling, I recognized what you said in that, I think you're a good story listener. Do you think you're a good story listener? And do you feel brave in your system?
Do I feel brave?
Yes. Do you feel empowered? We're talking about power dynamics as well.
I think we are centering our discussion around film, since we had the film excerpt or the short movie in the beginning, and you are also referring to movies and film industry. If I'm thinking of the mode of listening, I think I have to admit, and I can assume that many of you in the audience also have to admit, that at the moment it tends to be a bit difficult to kind of pause to listen, whether that's another person or whether that's a work of art or whatever that is, to kind of find the tranquility of being in peace and concentrating heavily for a lengthy period on something that you really ought to listen to. And I think there comes the special power of film and the cinemas and feature film, since that is something that we've kind of learned. The auditorium will be blackened, and you are kind of in need of concentrating on what you see and what you hear. And I'm always puzzled in cinema theaters of the qualities of sound. And the sound of human voice is one of the most interesting things in a film screen, because that's something that is so articulated that you actually don't hear that kind of voice ever in real life. But what a strange nature can become of human voice, and even the ones that you can see the lips moving and you kind of, okay, that's the instrument, that's the human voice instrument. And I would say that is when one is concentrating on also listening to stories, so that becomes a kind of experience, a total experience, then that is easier to understand and listen to. But saying that, I'm kind of a bit worried whether we still can also hear stories when we are reading, for example, fiction novels, or when we are looking at visual art products. Can we kind of get to the stories behind the objects? And and the works of art, it's not quite easy. We have to learn that skill.
Thank you so much. It was a perfect segue to the end here. The time is soon going out. And I'd like to ask you a question in the end, which I'd like you to answer really shortly. And it is, we're talking about art and culture, also in the terms of activism, artivism. And just imagine, when we go out of this room, we are going out in the streets to demonstrate for something. And I'd like to ask you, if you were going out in the streets now to demonstrate for something, what would you demonstrate for or against? And which song would you listen to before going out?
I'll go last.
You go last.
Me too. I'm not an activist. But
I can go first. I'd like to go out in the streets and fight for climate justice, and I'd listen to Rage Against the Machine, where they sing, "Fuck you, I won't do what you tell me." Sorry. Yes, Ritika?
Yeah. My brother is a vegan, and he posed a really important question to me. And he said, so you're fighting for equality and you work in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion. I want to ask you, where does that stop? So equality for everyone, what does that really mean? And that for a vegan is also including any living creature on this planet. So just because if a white person has power over a black person, as humans we have power over animals. So really, where does that, right? What does that, so I think I will be out on the streets fighting for equality for every living being on planet Earth. And my song, I don't even know who it's by, but the song "This Is Me," oh my God, I'll come back from that movie, the circus movie. Oh, if anyone knows. There you go, that's it, The Greatest Showman, "This Is Me." There you go.
Henry?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for giving some time for thinking over. I think, because climate change is mentioned, that might have been my first big, and diversity is maybe too obvious in these surroundings, because we are all here for diversity. I would struggle against economical growth, because I think that is something that we shouldn't take for granted, that should be a kind of objective that we should go forward, because that is a reason behind many other problems.
And the music?
Some Finnish song that you wouldn't recognize anyway.
Okay. And Laila?
well, I think for me personally, and maybe this is what we have been fighting for with our work, is the narrative sovereignty for our people, and also maybe try to somehow, create the changes we need in the society to support that, and of course I would do a yoik when I do that before.
And finally, Jason?
It would be for the Land Back movement.
Yes.
It is, our stories, our language, our culture, our identity, our future, our past, present are all tied to the land. And I suppose I would play Bougie Natives by the Snotty Nose Res Kids.
We'll check all that music out.
Yeah.
Let's give a hand for this panel. And thank you so much to Diversify for facilitating this
Yes.
space. And let's be better story listeners as well. Thank you.